There's a country in the middle of the western Pacific Ocean with a population smaller than a single American college campus, no standing army of its own, and a total land area you could drive across in a single afternoon. And yet, when world leaders gather to discuss the future of the ocean, when climate negotiators sit down to argue over the planet's next 50 years, this tiny nation's voice is not politely tolerated in the background. It is listened to closely. Because this small archipelago has done something almost no other country on Earth has managed to do at anywhere near this scale. It has looked at the ocean surrounding it, understood exactly how fragile that ocean actually is, and then made a series of decisions, legal, cultural, and deeply personal, that the rest of the world is still, years later, struggling to catch up to. This is Palau. And to understand why a country of roughly 18,000 people commands this much respect on the world stage, you first have to understand what it actually means to live here. Palau sits in the western Pacific, part of the wider region known as Micronesia, an archipelago made up of around 340 individual islands, though only about 8 of them are actually inhabited. The vast majority of Palau's population lives on or near Koror, historically the country's largest town and commercial center, while the modern capital, a small, purpose-built city called Ngurlmud, sits on the much larger island of Babel Daob and remains even today one of the smallest and quietest national capitals anywhere on Earth. The total population of the country hovers right around 18,000 people, depending on the year you check. A number so small that entire mid-sized universities elsewhere in the world have more people enrolled in a single semester than Palau has citizens in its entire nation. And yet, despite that tiny population, Palau's political and legal reach extends across an almost absurdly large stretch of ocean. Its exclusive economic zone, the area of ocean over which the country holds legal authority and control, stretches across roughly 600,000 square kilometers, an area of open water larger than the entire country of France, all being managed, protected, and governed by a population smaller than many single American towns. To understand how a place this small ended up shaping global conversations about the ocean, you have to go back through its history, because Palau's relationship with outside power did not begin with independence. It began with a long, complicated sequence of foreign control. Spanish traders and missionaries arrived in the region in the 16th century, followed eventually by German colonial administration in the late 19th century, then Japanese control following the First World War, a period that left a lasting imprint still visible in parts of Palauan culture and language today. The Japanese administration ended violently and decisively during the Second World War, when Palau, and specifically the island of Peleliu, became the site of one of the most brutal battles of the entire Pacific Campaign. Beginning in September 1944, American forces fought Japanese defenders entrenched in Peleliu's caves and ridgelines in a battle that lasted over 2 months and produced staggering casualties on both sides. A fight so costly and so difficult that military historians still study it today as one of the war's most grueling engagements. After Japan's surrender, Palau came under United States administration as part of the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, a governing arrangement that continued for decades afterward. Full independence did not arrive until October 1st, 1994, making Palau, notably, the very last of the Pacific Trust territories to formally become its own sovereign nation. Upon independence, Palau entered into a compact of free association with the United States, an arrangement that continues today, providing Palau with financial assistance and access to a range of American domestic programs in exchange for the United States, retaining exclusive military access and defense responsibility for Palauan territory, a compact renewed and extended over the years since. But independence for Palau was never simply about achieving political sovereignty on paper. It was about finally gaining the authority to make its own decisions about the one resource that had always mattered more than anything else to its people, the ocean surrounding it. And almost immediately, Palau began using that authority in ways that would eventually put this tiny nation on the map in a way its size alone never could have. In 2009, Palau made a decision that no country on Earth had ever made before. It declared its entire exclusive economic zone, all 600,000 square kilometers of it, a shark sanctuary, banning commercial shark fishing across the whole of its territorial waters in one single sweeping act. To put the scale of that decision into proper perspective, Palau effectively placed an area of ocean larger than the entire landmass of France under legal protection, specifically for one of the ocean's most feared, most misunderstood, and most rapidly declining groups of predators. At the time, global shark populations were already in serious, well-documented decline, driven largely by demand for shark fin soup and other shark products across international markets, a demand so intense that researchers estimate tens of millions of sharks are killed globally every single year. Palau's leadership, drawing on the country's deep, long-standing cultural and economic connection to a healthy, functioning reef ecosystem, made the calculation that a living shark, drawing tourists and divers back again and again over the course of what can be a shark's remarkably long lifespan, sometimes living for decades under the right conditions, was worth dramatically more to the nation over time than a shark caught once and sold for its fins. It was a decision rooted as much in economics as it was in conservation, and it worked. Divers now travel from every corner of the world, specifically because Palau's reefs remain healthy enough to reliably support large, thriving shark populations, an increasingly rare sight in many other parts of the world's oceans. That shark sanctuary turned out to be only the beginning. In 2015, Palau went even further, passing legislation to establish the Palau National Marine Sanctuary, a sweeping piece of environmental law that placed a full 80% of the country's exclusive economic zone into a fully protected, no-take marine reserve, permanently banning commercial fishing and extractive activity like oil and mineral exploration across the overwhelming majority of its own waters. The remaining 20% of Palauan waters was reserved specifically for domestic fishing and limited, carefully managed commercial activity, ensuring that Palauan communities themselves would retain access to the resources they had always depended on, while the vast majority of the surrounding ocean was left to recover and thrive, undisturbed by large-scale extraction. At the time it was passed, this was one of the most ambitious ocean protection measures ever enacted anywhere on the planet at this scale, a small country voluntarily walking away from a substantial share of its own potential fishing revenue, betting instead on the long-term value of a healthy, intact ocean. Both for its own people and for the divers and eco-tourists it hoped to continue attracting for generations to come. Alongside these sweeping marine protections, Palau built something smaller in scale but genuinely unique in the world of tourism and environmental policy, the Palau Pledge. Beginning in 2017, every single visitor arriving in the country is required, as part of standard immigration procedure, to sign a formal pledge, printed directly into their passport as an official stamp, committing to act in an ecologically and culturally responsible manner throughout their stay. It reads, in part, as a promise made not to the Palauan government, but directly to the children of Palau, an unusual and deliberately personal piece of legal language for an immigration document, framing environmental responsibility not as a bureaucratic formality, but as a genuine binding commitment made to the next generation of the people whose home you're about to visit. It was the first program of its kind anywhere in the world, a small island nation essentially asking every visitor crossing its border to formally acknowledge, in writing, that they understood the fragility of what they were about to experience, and to commit to protecting it. Palau backed that pledge with concrete, enforceable policy as well. In 2020, the country became one of the first in the world to formally ban sunscreens containing oxybenzone and octinoxate, chemical compounds that research has linked to coral bleaching and reef damage, requiring visitors instead to use reef-safe alternatives, a small but genuinely meaningful step aimed directly at protecting the coral ecosystems that make Palau's waters so remarkable in the first place. And it is genuinely worth pausing here to understand exactly what those waters actually look like, because the scale of Palau's conservation effort only makes sense once you understand what precisely it is working so hard to protect. Palau's most iconic natural features are its rock islands, several hundred small, mushroom-shaped limestone islands scattered across the country's southern lagoon. Their bases eroded away over thousands of years by wave action and the acidic secretions of the marine life clinging to them, leaving each island perched dramatically above the waterline on a narrower stalk of rock beneath, densely covered in green vegetation on top, giving the entire region a strange, almost otherworldly appearance from above. In 2012, the Rock Island's southern lagoon was formally designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized specifically for its combination of extraordinary natural beauty and rich marine biodiversity, one of the relatively few sites in the entire world to earn that recognition for both natural and cultural significance simultaneously, reflecting the deep, ongoing relationship between Palauan communities and this particular stretch of ocean and islands. Nestled among these rock islands is one of the single strangest and most genuinely magical places in all of Palau, Jellyfish Lake. This is a marine lake, a body of salt water completely enclosed by the surrounding limestone island, connected to the open ocean only through a narrow network of underground fissures and tunnels, too small for most large marine predators to pass through. Roughly 12,000 years ago, as sea levels rose following the last ice age, a population of golden jellyfish became trapped within this isolated lake, and over the many thousands of years since, cut off almost entirely from predators and, therefore, no longer under the same evolutionary pressure to defend themselves, these jellyfish gradually lost the majority of their sting, evolving into a population now considered safe for visitors to swim among directly, surrounded by an estimated several million drifting golden jellyfish, pulsing gently through the water in extraordinary numbers found almost nowhere else on the planet. It stands today as one of Palau's most visited natural wonders, a swimmable, living demonstration of exactly the kind of quiet, isolated evolutionary process that usually plays out over millennia entirely unseen by human eyes, here made accessible enough for any visitor with a mask and snorkel to witness firsthand. None of this natural richness exists in isolation from Palauan culture and identity. And this is a genuinely important part of understanding why the country's environmental policies feel less like top-down government regulation and more like a direct extension of long-standing local tradition. Long before modern marine sanctuary legislation existed anywhere in the world, Palauan communities practiced their own traditional systems of resource management, a practice known locally as bull, a customary form of temporary fishing moratorium, traditionally declared by local chiefs and community leaders to allow specific reef areas or fish populations time to recover after being harvested, a form of conservation embedded directly into Palauan governance and community life for generations, long before international conservation organizations arrived with their own modern frameworks and terminology. When Palau's national government began drafting its Protected Areas Network Act, formalizing a nationwide framework of marine and terrestrial protected zones, it specifically built the legislation to involve and empower local communities directly, allowing them to conduct their own scientific and social assessments of their surrounding environment and explicitly supporting these same traditional resource management systems that had already been quietly protecting Palauan waters for far longer than any formal national law had existed. As a direct result of this approach, Palau has established 35 distinct protected areas across the country, covering reefs, lagoons, mangrove forests, and dedicated sanctuaries for specific species, achieving, and consistently maintaining since, protection across 30% of its near-shore marine environment and 20% of its land area, figures that place Palau well ahead of the vast majority of countries anywhere in the world in terms of the sheer proportion of its own natural environment placed under active enforced protection. All of this conservation effort connects directly and quite deliberately to Palau's economy, because for a country this small, with limited land for large-scale agriculture and no significant industrial base to speak of, tourism is not simply one part of Palau's economy. It is, overwhelmingly, the engine driving the entire thing, alongside a smaller but still economically significant fishing sector, focused heavily on tuna. And crucially, the tourism Palau has chosen to build its economy around is not mass tourism in the traditional sense, the kind built around enormous resort complexes and high visitor volume, regardless of environmental cost. It is deliberately positioned around exactly the kind of high-value, conservation-minded diving and ecotourism that Palau's protected reefs and healthy shark populations make possible in the first place. Researchers studying the economics of Palau's marine protected areas have specifically found that divers are consistently willing to pay a meaningful premium to dive within no-take marine protected zones, precisely because those protected waters reliably contain larger, more abundant fish populations and healthier, more vibrant reef ecosystems than comparable, unprotected waters elsewhere in the region. In other words, Palau's conservation policy is not simply an environmental sacrifice made at the expense of economic growth. It has become, quite directly, the foundation the entire national economy is built upon, a rare and genuinely successful example of a country discovering that protecting its natural environment and growing its economy are not actually in conflict with each other, but are, in Palau's specific case, one and the same strategy. Beyond its reefs and its tourism industry, Palau has continued positioning itself as a genuinely forward-looking small nation in other, less obvious ways as well. The country has explored blockchain-based digital residency programs aimed at attracting international entrepreneurs and investment despite its remote, small-scale geography, and has actively piloted ocean-based floating solar energy systems within its own lagoons, part of a broader, ongoing effort to reduce its historical dependence on imported diesel fuel for electricity generation, a genuinely difficult and expensive challenge for any small, remote island nation. Palau uses the United States dollar as its official currency, a practical arrangement reflecting its close and ongoing economic relationship with the United States under the terms of their Compact of Free Association. And the country's culture today reflects genuine diversity as well, shaped by its long and complicated colonial history, with Roman Catholic and various Protestant denominations representing the largest religious groups, alongside a meaningful population practicing Modakangai, an indigenous Palauan religious movement that emerged locally in the early 20th century, existing today alongside smaller Muslim and other religious communities, a genuinely diverse religious landscape for a country of this size, reflecting centuries of outside contact layered on top of deep, enduring indigenous tradition. And this, ultimately, is what makes Palau's global influence make genuine sense once you step back and look at the full picture together. This is not a wealthy nation using enormous financial resources to buy influence on the world stage, the way larger, more economically powerful countries sometimes do. It is a small, comparatively resource-limited island nation that has instead built its international credibility on the strength of its actions, being consistently first, first to declare a national shark sanctuary, among the first to ban reef-toxic sunscreen nationwide, first to formally ask every single visitor to sign a personal binding pledge to protect the local environment. On the global stage, in climate negotiations and ocean policy discussions, where Palau's government has remained consistently vocal, the country has repeatedly emphasized precisely why these issues carry such direct existential weight for a place like this. Rising sea levels, warming ocean temperatures, and increasingly severe coral bleaching events are not abstract, distant future concerns for a low-lying Pacific Island nation. They represent a direct, immediate threat to the physical existence of the very land and reefs that Palau's entire culture, economy, and identity have always been built around. When Palau's leadership speaks at international climate forums, they are not speaking as distant observers discussing someone else's problem. They are speaking as people whose home, quite literally, hangs directly in the balance of exactly the outcomes those negotiations are meant to decide. Perhaps that, more than any single policy or protected reef, is the real reason a country this small commands this much genuine respect and attention on the world stage. Palau never had the option of treating its ocean as a limitless, endlessly renewable resource to be exploited without real, lasting consequence. Every single person living across Palau's inhabited islands has always understood, whether formally articulated in national legislation or simply passed down quietly through generations of traditional practices like bull, that the health of the reef surrounding them and the health of their own community have never truly been separate things at all. They have always been, in every meaningful sense, exactly the same thing. In choosing to formalize and expand that understanding into some of the most ambitious ocean protection policy anywhere in the world, Palau didn't simply protect its own corner of the Pacific for its own benefit alone. It offered the rest of the world a small, quiet, genuinely working example of what becomes possible when a nation decides, deliberately and consistently, that the long-term health of its ocean matters more than whatever short-term value could be extracted from it instead. In a world still overwhelmingly struggling to make that same difficult choice at any meaningful scale, that alone, more than land area, more than population, more than economic output, may be exactly why the entire world has learned to listen so closely to a country this small. If stories like this, about the places and the people, quietly redefining what it actually means to live in balance with the ocean, are the kind of thing you want more of, make sure you're subscribed, because there is a lot more of this world still waiting to be explored, and you won't want to miss what we uncover next.